Hi, my name is Matt Schultz. I'm a consulting forester. I own and operate Pine Curve Consulting Forestry. I work predominantly with private landowners. I've been working with private landowners for approximately 15 years. I enjoy forestry because it's a very dynamic, science-based profession. I feel that almost on a weekly, if not a daily basis, I learn something new about forestry or about working with people. One of the greatest things that I enjoy about consulting forestry is helping private landowners sustainably and responsibly manage their forest. I grew up in an area where there was a lot of forest management, and I've seen a lot of management that wasn't necessarily so good, and so I really pride myself on practicing good forest management on all the properties that I manage. Forest fragmentation has a multitude of impacts on Wisconsin forests, from wildlife habitat to increased fire risk to poor water quality. When you fragment a forest through development or agriculture or some non-forest land management practice, basically you're limiting the forest's natural cycle and progress of nature. For instance, if you build a subdivision, you're most likely going to have more runoff and point source pollution and maybe even non-point source pollution. You could disrupt native wildlife habitats, potentially introduce more invasive species to the area, and it becomes a burden when parcels are fragmented to a small size for landowners to accomplish management activities that oftentimes are necessary due to other concerns such as insect and disease outbreaks or wind events in their forest, just because they have a small enough parcel that it's not economical for a commercial logger to be able to come in and do work on those parcels alone, and so oftentimes you need multiple parcels to be able to do that work, which complicates the project because oftentimes different people have different values, and getting everybody on the same page to do something can be challenging. Foresters and landowners, by working together, can overcome the impacts of forest fragmentation by developing a cooperative plan amongst several landowners to identify resource concerns on their property. It could be something as simple as just maintaining tree and forest health, or something that's more complicated, such as restoring a natural system if you're in an area that has high invasive species populations. The most important part of that relationship and that develops between landowners and that group connection is communication. So the two primary benefits that I would say that most people see directly from combining timber sales is a greater ability to market their wood. There's so many cases where small timber sales are just not marketable commercially to a logger. They're just simply too small. The other benefit, which is less of a benefit but oftentimes can be a benefit, is potentially more timber revenue from having a combined timber sale that's potentially bigger in size with maybe more valuable species. But generally, in my experience, it's the first rather than the second that is the driving factor. It's simply a matter of, we can get somebody to do this for us and it's not going to cost us anything, versus making more money above and beyond what they would typically make. Generally speaking, I wouldn't say that a landowner is going to spend any more or any less on a forester if it's a combined timber sale. Usually the forester is going to generally charge a similar rate for the combined sale, because the projects are going to be of equal in nature, and there should be a good benefit to the forester as well as the landowner and to the logger, given the size of the sale is adequate to produce a commercial sale. Generally speaking, landowners may get a higher return on their timber sale if it's combined with other properties. There's a lot of variables that influence that, so it's not always the case. By far the greatest benefit to a combined timber sale is marketability. It's a simple fact of economy of size. The more wood volume you typically have, the more interested any logger is going to be in it. So generally, in my experience, there's two methods that landowners go about setting up a collaborative timber sale. There's the method where the landowners have already spoke prior to talking to the forester and are organized and approach a forester with the intent of having a collaborative timber sale. The other method is usually one landowner approaches a forester and expresses an interest to have a timber sale, but does not have enough timber to harvest on their own, and may make mention that a couple of the other neighbors might be interested, and it's the forester's responsibility to make contact with the other landowners and find out if they're interested to pursue a combined timber sale. One neighbor harvesting their property can actually cause detriment to the other's neighbor's property if it's not harvested due to increased wind throw is usually generally the most common issue, but there's just so much legwork that's involved when I have to take the lead on organizing all the different parties, and then oftentimes you get a mixed bag of responses. Some people are all for moving forward with timber harvest, and other people, after they've met, they don't have an interest, and you end up with a timber sale that, while it's combined, it's still in a patchwork pattern. You know, maybe you'll have a lot or two here, and then across or kitty corner down the road you might have another lot or two, which makes it a little bit less logistically feasible for both myself and the logger, and again detracts from its interest. So it's really important to try to have a good, you know, working group of landowners that hopefully have a fair amount of timber or a fair amount of property, you know, in a really close area, so that, you know, all operations can be relatively constrained and efficient. When you're conducting a collaborative timber sale, I found through the course of business that the more organized the landowner group can be, the more efficient and smoothly the process runs for the forester. If in an ideal situation, if the landowner group has one contact person for the forester to communicate, you know, broad progress updates with and broad questions with, is ideal. More detailed property specific questions are obviously going to be directed to individual property owners, but simple things like making contact to sign documents and shuffle papers is really much easier for the forester if he can rely on one point of contact for the landowner group to hand that information off to, and then they can meet with each individual landowner as they're around. It becomes really time burdensome, and oftentimes is an increased cost if I have to take the extra time to, say, meet with people on different weekends, because that's the only time that they're going to be around to sign contracts or approve harvest plans. If I can give that information to one landowner and he can meet with them during the weekends or whenever those other people are available, that frees up a lot of time for me and makes the process go a lot quicker and a lot smoother. This particular timber sale that I'm standing in right here was a cooperative timber harvest between a municipal airport property and 3 private landowners. The primary objective of this harvest was to clear this fence that you see on to my left of trees that were falling on it on the airport property. One of the obstacles that I ran into upon establishing this sale was that the property boundary of the adjoining property owners was actually very close to the fence line on this easterly side, and trees from those properties were actually falling onto this fence as well, damaging it. We didn't have any ability to harvest those trees because they were on other people's properties. So upon finding that, working predominantly by myself and with the logger, through the course of time and activity at this sale, we were able to make contact with 3 or 4 additional private landowners that owned property along here to talk to them to harvest the overmature aspen that were the principal trees that were in decline and falling on the fence on their property. And once we explained what we were doing here and why, and that they could make a few extra dollars by harvesting those trees and helping the municipal property out, they were all on board for it, and we worked together to basically establish their harvests and do the harvesting. In this particular situation, the cooperation and logistics was kind of a mixed bag between myself and the logger. I directly worked with 2 of the landowners, and the logger, through discussions with me, directly worked with 1 or 2 kind of by themselves. I had established all the boundary line work, and the harvest prescription of basically just removing the old failing aspen was pretty straightforward, and the logger just basically made contact with those landowners kind of by chance while they were in operations and said, we'd like to harvest these trees, and they were okay, and took the appropriate steps to get timber sale contracts established for everything. And long story short, we were able to harvest all of the old mature trees on the private property that were falling onto the municipal fence line. So it really worked out well for everybody involved in it, and had these private property owners not taken advantage of the municipal timber harvest, they likely would not have been able to get somebody just to come in to harvest those failing trees. They didn't have a real strong interest in harvesting other areas of their property because they're relatively small and they have other objectives for those areas, but they definitely had an interest in harvesting the trees that were in decline. My guess is that in the future, there probably won't be a whole lot of harvesting that occurs on those properties unless there's something going on here. So when I'm working on a particular property and there maybe isn't a wildlife habitat benefit as a primary objective, as a forester, as a part of the due diligence that I have to manage a resource, wildlife habitat for a variety of species is always in the back of my mind and should be in the back of all foresters' minds. When you're talking about forest management and wildlife habitat, there really isn't such a thing as one type of habitat, or let me rephrase that. Whatever you do in forest management is going to create some type of habitat for some species. Some species need very specific niche habitats to thrive. Other species are generalists. So no matter what you do, you're always creating some type of habitat, even if it's a clear cut. The trick is balancing the landowner's objectives of timber revenue, timber quality, with wildlife habitat. In those situations, generally speaking, the trees that you're going to be using for wildlife habitat generally have a fairly low economic timber value. A prime example of that is in a northern hardwood stand, you might have a hollow basswood tree. Virtually no economic value in that tree. You might have a tree that is of similar characteristics that's hard maple, that has a nice log but maybe has a hollow spot on it. In that particular situation, if the landowner was interested in maximizing revenue, I would be much more inclined to leave that basswood and harvest that hard maple that still has a fair amount of value, but also shows that it's in a position where it could decline significantly between now and the next entry in 15 or 20 years. The flip side of that is that if I'm working with a landowner that their primary objective is wildlife habitat, I may decide to actually leave those 2 trees and harvest other trees because I know that those trees are going to create a niche for a suite of cavity dwelling species. You could expand that out to even age clear cut harvests like we're looking at right here, or other types of harvests. There's lots of small things that can be done in all of these harvests that benefit wildlife, such as leaving green tree retention and patches and as individual trees and clear cuts, which really at the end of the day amounts to a very little loss in timber revenue, especially if you utilize species that aren't marketable, such as cedar, hemlock, basswood's marketable, but it's still of low value. Yes, so invasive species are a huge deal and a growing threat. In this area in northern Wisconsin, in the last 15 years, we've seen a huge uptick in a lot of invasive species, predominantly garlic mustard. It's really high on my radar. I'm always on the lookout for it, and it's imperative that landowners, if they have the physical and financial ability to control those species, do so as soon as possible. A lot of the areas where I see invasive species now are limited to very small patches, and with a relatively minimal amount of work you can pretty much extinguish that infestation of garlic mustard or honeysuckle. Some areas they're gone for the time being, and you have to focus your efforts when you're going to actually treat that timber stand versus when you're not treating that timber stand, because you need that window of control to facilitate hopefully a good age class of regeneration. I don't myself don't do a whole lot of actual on the ground invasive species control, but I do a lot of invasive species planning work with private landowners. I do a lot of invasive species work on my own time, on private property, on my own private property. So I'm pretty well versed with the different methods and the different species, at least for what we have in northern Wisconsin. What I always tell people is to, pursue funding. Get a hold of NRCS, work through the EQIP program. That funding is there for people that want to be on the ground and improve their property, and the little bit of work that you do up front now on invasive species is really going to make a lot in the future, especially if you can get rid of those small infestations. So I'm really a big supporter of invasive species control early on especially.